If someone says, I want to measure it for like all use cases, that is something that's technically just not possible right now, given a lot of engineering constraints and challenges. And going forward, where we see synthetic data positioning itself as a domain, again, with the increase in data protection regulations, companies are heavily worried because they have to comply. And secondly, they have to protect customer data. Given these regulations, it promotes or encourages companies to be mindful of data sharing practices. In other words, data sharing has become super slow. So synthetic data is one way to take the actual real data, which I say it's quite radioactive because it's sensitive. And through AI, you can now transform it into synthetic data that takes its radioactivity or sensitivity away. Or in other words, now it does not belong to anyone who's a real person, but it still understands the behavior of the customers or the structure of the data set that the model was trained on.
I saw a link recently where nowadays there are all these avatars that are getting created using purely synthetic data. So, I mean, the entire maybe actors, actresses whose schedules are very packed.
Yes.
They may or may not be able to appear for a photo shoot. So what is happening is people are creating these avatars using synthetic data, which may replicate these actors or actresses or could be a new character altogether. How do you see synthetic data evolving in this space? Is that something you do as a company?
So creating 3D models, let's say out of thin air using AI, it's definitely a use case of synthetic data. And in parallel, you can kind of take someone's likeness. So let's say if it's Pramodh, we have Pramodh's physique, how you look like, maybe your behavior. And based on that, we can create your digital twin or a digital avatar, which is not you in a way, but it resembles you.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cybersecurity's Safe TechTalk episode. Today we have with us Uzair Javaid. Uzair is the CEO and co-founder of Betterdata, a company focused on programmable synthetic data that helps data science teams to safely access and share data while complying with global data protection regulations. Uzair has a PhD from the National University of Singapore, where he ethically hacked the Ethereum blockchain and is passionate about AI and privacy-preserving techniques. I'm glad you're here, Uzair. We've been talking about this for a while. Good to have you here on this show today.
Thank you, Pramod, for having me. Excited.
Are you ready for the first question?
Definitely.
Okay, let's go. How do you see let's define synthetic data for our audience?
Synthetic data essentially means any data that you create artificially using AI as well as non-AI techniques. It has been around in the market for the last decade, but with the advancements in AI, it has come to a point of such realism that even AI models cannot distinguish anymore what's real versus synthetic. So given this ultra realism in its generation, it has started to see adoption with enterprises. And one of our key focus areas is how companies can use synthetic data and comply with privacy laws.
So what are the implications here and what are the use cases?
So the implications here is in order to generate good quality synthetic data, you need good data in the first place. And secondly, when we talk about training AI models and generating synthetic data, there is a concept called overfitting, which means that instead of models training on the data, they start to memorize the data. So there is a risk that models overfit and create data that belongs to an actual individual or a group of real individuals. And of course, when that happens, you can be held legally accountable. So AI has to go hand in hand with privacy by design fundamentals so that any company that is using synthetic data, it has to also ensure it is privacy preserving. So that's like one of the biggest implications from a generation point of view. And second, what we have been observing in the market for the last few years, how do you measure the performance of synthetic data in comparison with real data? So this is just like an open book question, but one way that customers address this concern is you can use real data to train a machine learning model and get an accuracy score or any other performance metric that you care about. And then you simply replicate the experiment with synthetic data and see how the performance is like. So then you can see, given real data, I got this performance. Given synthetic data, I got this performance. So the point being, you have to have a use case in hand, and then you kind of go backwards from there if you have to measure synthetic data. If someone says, I want to measure it for like all use cases, that is something that is technically just not possible right now, given a lot of engineering constraints and challenges. And going forward, where we see synthetic data positioning itself as a domain is again with the increase in data protection regulations. Companies are heavily worried because they have to comply, and secondly, they have to protect customer data. Given these regulations, it promotes or encourages companies to be mindful of data sharing practices. Or in other words, data sharing has become super slow. So synthetic data is one way to take the actual real data, which I say it's quite radioactive because it's sensitive. And through AI, you can now transform it into synthetic data that takes its radioactivity or sensitivity away. Or in other words, now it does not belong to anyone who's a real person, but it still understands the behavior of the customers or the structure of the data set that the model was trained on. And companies can use synthetic data without worrying about compliance and use it for their downstream use cases as well as tasks in a much more efficient manner.
Was there, in your experience, what kind of companies would most benefit from the advent of synthetic data?
So on a global level, when we look at data itself, there are three kinds of domains, I would say, that are heavily regulated. One is financial, and second is healthcare. The third is government. So government, by definition, is sensitive. If you ask people, I mean, based on a lot of surveys, the consensus is users say my financial data is the most sensitive, or in other words, regulated. And if you look at regulations, actually actively apply more on healthcare data than financial. So globally speaking, these are like the three domains. And any business, big or small, if they want to do something in these domains, they have to worry a lot about data regulations.
What about the use case of synthetic data in the field of Gen AI? I saw a link recently where nowadays there are all these avatars that are getting created, right? Using purely synthetic data. So, I mean, the entire maybe actors, actresses whose schedules are very packed.
Yes.
They may or may not be able to appear for a photo shoot. So what is happening is people are creating these avatars using synthetic data, which may replicate these actors or actresses or could be a new character altogether, right? Yeah. How do you see synthetic data evolving in this space? And is that something you do as a company?
So creating 3D models, let's say out of thin air using AI, it's definitely a use case of synthetic data. And in parallel, you can kind of take someone's likeness. So let's say if it's Pramodh, we have Pramod's physique, how you look like, maybe your behavior. And based on that, we can create your digital twin or a digital avatar, which is not you in a way, but it resembles you.
It could look exactly like me.
Definitely. If
Okay.
you do a one-to-one representation, or you may have seen like actors featured in video games,
Yes.
and it's essentially like one-to-one replica. So I play a lot of video games, so that's one thing I have been observing for a while. So one-to-one replication is there, that is possible. But with synthetic data, the idea is instead of one-to-one replication, how can you break that from a privacy or fairness perspective and use your likeness and transform it into something that isn't you, but still looks similar to your profile. Some users are appreciating that. Some users have concern that it's taking my likeness or my profile and transforming it into something that anyone can use. So it might be invasive in that manner. So yeah, I mean, with synthetic data, it's a clear use case. You can use it to create 3D models with or without an actual human as a reference. But when we talk about better data, that is on our roadmap, but not the focus at the moment. So right now we are closely working with data science teams in regulated enterprises like banks and government institutions. So they have a lot of customer data, they have a lot of sensitive business data. So we provide them our platform to transform it into synthetic data while preserving privacy and still extracting the functional value that the real data has. So previously with real data, if they were to share it, it takes a couple of months. Now with synthetic data, they can share it instantly in a few days to a few hours, depending on their use case as well as infra requirements.
Thanks for sharing this. You took a step back just now to define synthetic data. Let's take another step back. Why did you decide to pursue work in this field? What got you attracted to this?
So it's a bit of a personal story attached to it. So during my PhD was focused on using blockchain to address data privacy and data security challenges. So for 3 years, I was operating under the notion that blockchain is really good for security. And based on that, you can design these kind of systems. But last year, I wanted to challenge my own assumption that blockchain is secure, but what about the security of the blockchain itself? So that's where I started to work on my ethical hacking experiment. At the end of my 4th year, I hacked the Ethereum blockchain by exploiting their wallet generation mechanism.
Let's take a pause. Let's go into that. How did you hack the Ethereum blockchain?
So when we talk about Ethereum or any blockchain platform, you need a wallet to interact with the blockchain. Without a wallet, there is simply no interaction. So when we zoom in on the wallet aspect, what you get is you have a private key, or in other words, your password. Then you have a public key, which is extracted from the private key. And from that public key, essentially, you get your blockchain address or Ethereum address.
Is your public key your address, or is there another layer processing before you get the address? Your public key is your address, right?
Yes. Okay. So in some protocols, you can use the public key to establish that something is coming from someone who is saying who they are. But in blockchain, they add another process based on the public key. It's essentially 64 bits in length, if I remember it correctly. But to save the computational overhead, this processing reduces it from 64 bits to 40 bits. And when you talk about computation, it makes a lot of difference. So blockchain platforms do that. From public key, they hash it to get your public address.
Okay, then how do you hack it? How do you hack the Ethereum blockchain?
So I mainly looked at the wallet itself.
Which wallet was this? Is it MetaMask?
Ethereum. No, it's essentially Ethereum. When it creates a wallet, then you can use MetaMask, you can use an exchange, you can use like different platforms, which is simply an implementation of its protocol.
Yes.
So I went deep into its protocol and studied how it was generating private keys in the first place. So the cryptography it uses, it's called elliptic curve cryptography, ECC. And based on that, what it does is you have a curve. From the curve, it computes a point. And from that point itself, it computes your private key in a way that it's impossible to reproduce it. Otherwise, it beats the purpose of generating a private key with a random point or random number on the curve. So I studied this and essentially came up with my own private key generation mechanism. And so based on that, I created more than 1 million private keys based on my method. And from there, I extracted the public keys and then the Ethereum addresses. And finally, when I had more than 1 million Ethereum addresses, I downloaded all the live addresses on the Ethereum blockchain, and I just did a cross-reference and got 670 hits, which meant that I had
670 hits.
Yes.
Okay.
Which meant that I had the private keys of 670 users.
Yes.
And I could just access the wallet and get the funds out.
Interesting. What do you do after that?
So after that, whenever I share about this story, I specifically mention the word ethical.
Yes.
So of course, I didn't access those accounts. It's publicly documented in my thesis. I reported it to the Ethereum community. And I hope all those users have been notified that your wallets are compromised. Might as well create new or source other solutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Uzair. Very important to have ethical hackers like you in the community. You reported this, but now what we just discussed on this show is that it's possible for us to create our own private generator. So then what's the fix for that?
So when we talk about cryptography in general, it is heavily driven by mathematics. And when we talk about creating a random number generator, it has to guarantee some probabilities that given a private key generated, the probability of reproducing it is so small
yes,
that it's just impossible to compute. Now, elliptic curve cryptography, it's one. You have RSA, then you have TLS, AES, the same thing. Is they all create a private key based on some function, and how easy or difficult it is to break that function is where you have essentially NIST, the National Institute of Standards in the US. So whatever, I mean, you can come up with anything. They are the ones kind of approving of it for commercialization. And the way it can be commercialized is that whatever generator you make, it has to promise something that it's just mathematically impossible or practically infeasible to break.
yes.
And based on that, a lot of or pretty much most of the cryptographic protocols you have, they get approved and standardized that way. So anyone is welcome, but proving that is where the hard work is. Yeah.
So interesting. Would you say that the Ethereum blockchain became more resilient as a result of your work?
I hope so.
Okay.
I mean, I did my part. I reported it. It's publicly available, and I spread awareness on it as much as I can. So not just Ethereum, but I hope, I mean, the attack itself can be implemented on all other blockchain platforms. So I do hope that somewhere someone does take notice.
Absolutely. And you did all of that here in Singapore.
Yes.
Very interesting. Okay, now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about AI in cybersecurity. How do you see AI being used in cybersecurity?
So within cybersecurity, what I have observed is given some cybersecurity incident, one way of investigating is one way is to replicate the incident altogether and kind of go backwards from there to see what happened. But sometimes because of lack of data, recreating that scenario is something that is just not possible. So AI, or again, synthetic data in this case, it allows cybersecurity professionals to be able to simulate scenarios. Just like a video game, you have a gaming engine, you can use it to create anything, like this room, you with avatars, or like a whole environment. So same situation with the cybersecurity analysis as well. If you were to simulate any scenario for which you didn't have data, but maybe you have some domain knowledge, maybe you have some other signals or indicators, then you can use Gen AI to kind of reproduce that, build much more robust solutions, or let's say testing routines against it. So that's one use case. And secondly, again, when we talk about cybersecurity, data sharing, it's one of the big concerns when companies have to collaborate with other companies. My company has to give data to someone else. It's quite a hard exercise to say how vigilant they are about protecting it. So security as well as privacy kind of goes hand in hand here. So data is the content, but you kind of have to create the pipeline for it to be easily transmitted and only be used by the authorized recipients. So with Gen AI, again, the idea is instead of sending real data with all those, which is like a time bomb actually, you just send synthetic data and don't worry even if someone mishandles it or leaks it.
Okay, now I like to make it very real for our user because we're discussing things at a level where security professionals, AI researchers, that's where we delve in, right?
Yep.
But if I am a bank and I am dealing with customer data day in and day out, can you give me a real example of how I can use synthetic data, making sure that security of my customers is preserved or even potentially enhanced?
So with banks, one use case that reoccurs a lot, I think given a fairly sized bank, we can say they maybe test anywhere from like hundreds of new vendors every year. Or just to take a step back, before they onboard a new vendor, there is usually a request for proposal and RFP. And for that RFP, you can have N number of different participants. So let's assume you have five different companies who applied for one RFP. Now, for the bank to evaluate all of them, we again assume all of them are AI companies. And with AI, you need data to demonstrate your product. But the bank has to do risk management on each of them one by one. And based on how their risk profile is, they will give them a version of the data that can be high quality or low quality. So you have one RFP, five proposals, and you kind of do the same exercise one by one. So in our case, the idea is, what if within one click of a button, you can train an AI model on the real data, and after training to all of those five proposals, you can send the same quality of data in synthetic form. So it's a much more fair analysis, and you can then simply pick the best one.
Let's digest that for a moment. So this is definitely being used when you are selecting vendors during your process when you're requesting for a proposal. Any other use case? Doesn't have to be a bank, can be anywhere.
Yeah.
Just a real use case.
Yes. So another use case that I would like to highlight is a lot of companies who are handling customer data. They have this concern that I collect customer data for one use case and comply with the privacy law. But tomorrow, I want to use this data for another use case. So do I need customer consent for that or not? So short answer is yes, you do. If you are using real data.
Yes, you need customer consent.
Explicit.
Yes.
Like literally, if you have 1 million customers, you have to send 1 million notifications and ask them to opt in. But how customers behave if you ask them to opt in, even if they don't understand what's going on, they'll just say opt out. So there's like high business risk attached to it. So in our case, the angle is, instead of using real data where you need consent, and tomorrow use cases will change, it's not scalable, you can use synthetic data, which belongs to no one, which means privacy laws no longer apply. And that
or rather, privacy laws are respected.
Yes, or appreciated.
Yes.
Yes. And which in turn means that you no longer need customer consent. Now, this is something which is, you don't have to take my word. Regulators like in Singapore as well as the UK have voiced similar narratives, and it can be publicly checked as well. So that's like one use case where any companies who want to leverage data without seeking consent, they can do so in synthetic form.
Very interesting. When we spoke about AI a bit earlier, I wanted to also ask you about use cases where you see AI being effective in threat detection, anomaly analysis, security analytics. Can you discuss a bit more? You're really pretty much operating at the intersection of security and privacy, right? With synthetic data.
Yes.
Can you share a bit more about how AI is proven effective in those areas I just mentioned?
Yes. So when we talk about anomaly detection, the challenge with anomalies always is, if you have, like, the challenge with anomalies is the occurrence is extremely low, or the frequency of the event is extremely low. So you have your data set, and anomalies might represent maybe 1 or 2% of it. So when you use this type of data to train a machine learning model, because of this huge imbalance, it gives you results that are quite bad. So with synthetic data, one use case, again, it's you have customer transaction data, or you have transaction data of any nature, and you want to predict fraud. Now, how businesses define fraud is subjective, but we assume it's just customers making transactions of high volumes. Let's say in one burst, you have 10 transactions, and each transaction is like 10,000, more than 10,000 in value. So with synthetic data, what you can do is take this data set and address this class imbalance. I mean, you can do it one-to-one as well, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense. But with AI, now you can use this extremely small percentage of data and explode it in its scope. So let's say if we had 100 samples and then 5 of them were anomalous, we can use synthetic data to take that number 5 and transform it into maybe 50 or even 100, depending on some engineering constraints. And given that, you can build a machine learning model which is much better in prediction, because the model has now much more information to train on. So any company again which is doing prediction with banks, it's like fraud prediction. You can use data imbalance challenges to be rectified with synthetic data, and that in turn gives you models or any other data analysis which could be non-machine learning in nature to be much more accurate or much more applicable to the use cases.
So, Zach, do you think that OpenAI is using synthetic data?
I think OpenAI has so much data that they do not use synthetic data at this point.
Okay.
But going into the future, I do foresee this one trend happening where when we look at the early 2000s, we saw all the mobile phone makers fighting a lot on patents. So if you have used, I mean, if you saw Google Pixel 2, which is one phone I used previously, they had a fingerprint scanner on the back of the phone. Google has a patent for that, which is why no other company places it there. Even if they place it, it cannot be circular in its design. It should be square or it should be just a line. Now, similarly, Apple has a patent for the home circular button in front of the phone. Anyone else who has to use it, they have to pay for it. And of course, as a business, no one does that. So with data is going to kind of trigger this conflict of IPs. Like OpenAI has used my data to train their models, I'm going to sue them. I mean, there have been lawsuits already. So the angle would be two angles. One is I use, let's say, Pramod's data. Easy fix is I just incentivize you. Pramod, can I use your data? And every month you get $100. As a user, I'm happy, go ahead. But on a larger scale, there is a much higher reputational risk for the company. And if someone comes sues them for, I don't know, like millions to billions of dollars, then quite the catch. So in that case, when we talk about data attribution, real data belongs to real people, that's plain and simple. But they could use synthetic data to kind of alleviate these concerns around data attribution. And in doing that, they can also incentivize users, which would be like the perfect fix. So going forward, I do see any AI company will suffer a lot from data attribution challenges, and synthetic data would be one way to kind of fix those. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I'm now seeing the growing importance of synthetic data in so many different varied use cases, especially as the future is coming onto us. Global privacy laws, I wanted to talk about that. How do you see that impacting data access and sharing? And we just discussed AI companies needing to solve for data attribution problems, right? Laws are likely to get tighter around these. But then I'd love to get your opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, at Betterdata as well, the macro trend we are tracking is the increase in privacy laws. And I strongly believe if you look at the next 10 years, the graph it's just going to go up. Because all of these tech companies, when you hear Google lost a few $1 million because of a 5-minute outage, I cannot comprehend that. But it's just that Google has used our data to build a business model that has that kind of impact. Now, in doing so, no one asked me about my data, no one asked me about my consent. But in 2018, GDPR kind of kickstarted this whole revolution around data being my fundamental right. And if someone uses that, they need my consent. And the moment I say delete it, then you just have to delete it. So that that whole trend was kickstarted in 2018. And globally, it affected upwards of 28 million businesses, which is not a small number. And fast forward to today, we are seeing similar trends across the US, where you have the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. In Asia, we have China, PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law. So last year, they fined Didi, which is their Uber, more than $1 billion for non-compliance with their privacy as well as data security law. So I think on a global outlook, privacy laws are definitely increasing. Companies are worried because of fear of fines if they non-comply. And for them to comply with them, privacy technologies is like the way to operationalize all that. Now back to companies, any company who wants to share data internally within the same country, or if it's multi-regional, or if they want to share data with external parties like partners or vendors or any other collaborators they want to work with. For compliance, they just have to protect the data. Like plain and simple, if you really narrow it down to one actionable item, it's like you are sending customer data to another business unit, to another vendor, protect it. But I, as a user, I'm like, how do I protect it? And that's where regulations also don't shed a lot of light. There's a lot of things. I wouldn't say it's a gray area. I would say it's just an area which hasn't seen maturity yet. But privacy technologies is definitely the angle to help people, to help companies, individuals, teams, professionals, as well as enterprises to comply as well as safely share and access data.
So most companies would be focused on building the business. Their roadmaps are likely oriented around going to market, making sure they're out serving their users, competing very closely in the market. How is it that companies will tune in to privacy, to nuances in privacy laws or privacy preserving technologies? Like, what is it that would encourage them to say, hey, I'm going to take this seriously now? Because for a company like Didi, $1 billion fine may be a drop in the ocean, right?
Definitely. So with companies, I think we can all assume customers are the lifeblood of any business. And because of these regulations, I think on the flip side, the awareness among the customers is just going up, or at least everyone is scratching their head to see how companies are using their data. And again, with the advent of ChatGPT, large language models, sensitive issues around data are amplified so much more in terms of its impact. So back to when we talk about the customers, I'll give you one example. In early 2021, WhatsApp updated its privacy policy, and whatever they did, when we go back to customers, I'll give you an example. In early 2021, WhatsApp updated their privacy policy, and that triggered a mass movement of more than 30 million users to shift from WhatsApp to Telegram and Signal. Now, 30 million users, if that is your user count, right, and this kind of migration happens, then you're basically like out of business.
Yes.
And this was triggered by one update to the privacy policy. So this is like the consequence.
What was this update?
Oh,
We'll have to check. We'll check and include it inside in the recording notes.
Yeah.
But thanks for sharing this.
Yeah. So the consequence here is, even as a business, I don't care. My customers care, which is why I must also care. And if we have seen recent ads from Apple,
yes,
we see the word privacy a lot. So they are placing their products and using privacy as a differentiator. And if you look at their market cap, it's definitely one of the most valuable companies out there. And if they are using privacy as a brand differentiator, then it signals that the trend is moving indeed in this direction.
It is very interesting. I think Apple in its marketing campaign has always been bold, and it's the first and only company so far that I've seen emphasize on privacy, and usually it's a trendsetter. So that is when I was in Bangalore recently, when I landed at the airport and I was going towards the city area, I could see in big bold the billboard, which was talking about privacy. So spot on, that is a very interesting trend which is being started, or at least from my knowledge, started and led by Apple. Apple users tend to be of a certain nature, and if Apple is driving privacy as a important differentiator, then I think the world will start to take notice.
Definitely.
Right? Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts that come to mind regarding privacy laws?
Just to, I think, share my thoughts. I strongly believe that without regulations, no one would care.
So regulations then need to become stricter. Is unlikely to be led purely by business. But then there's a part where you're saying that customers care. When customers care, businesses will have to care. So it's a combination of customers and regulations, right? The customers will be the incentives, right? And then the regulations will be the whip. If you don't get it right, then the fines will be pretty heavy, which can cause business interruption.
Precisely. Right? So it kind of goes hand in hand. You have regulations, but customer awareness as well, or we could say like customers are expecting more from businesses in terms of businesses using their data.
Yes.
And again, over time, with more and more ransomware attacks, with more and more breaches happening, real data is only going to get more and more regulated. But businesses have to make money, and privacy technologies will take the spotlight.
Okay. Do you think the time for privacy technologies has arrived?
Yes and no. When we talk about privacy technologies, I think for the last decade, one word that pretty much all of us are familiar with is data anonymization. So essentially, you have data, you reduce its quality, like you have an image and then you blur it to make sure that if I see that blurred image, I should not be able to say who this picture belongs to, or in other words, privacy is preserved. So that has been in the market for the last decade and so. Then I think 4 to 5 years, it has been 4 to 5 years that encryption and use technologies have also taken the spotlight, that you can encrypt data and use the encrypted data for analysis. This is something that wasn't previously possible, but something that a couple of technologies are building and offering. And fast forward to today, I think I'll take the example of ChatGPT, of how powerful Gen AI is. And synthetic data is indeed one of the offerings that Gen AI has, and that strongly applies to privacy. But it breaks the notion of encryption and anonymization, because encryption and anonymization, even after you apply it on real data, the data after being processed, it still belongs to real people. So you have this one-to-one mapping and the risk of re-identification. But with synthetic data, it breaks this one-to-one mapping. You train the model and then you generate data. And the angle is it's impossible now to trace it back to the real individual.
Thanks for sharing this. Want to switch gear a little bit on secure edge computation. Let's talk about secure edge computation offloading, which are key aspects of cybersecurity. Can you explain this concept of edge computing and its impact on cybersecurity, as well as the synthetic data use case?
Yes. So when we talk about edge computing, let's say we can take the example of CCTV cameras. Now, every building we can assume going forward, every building will have CCTV cameras for security purpose. Now, you are collecting all this feed, and on the back end, you are transmitting this data. Maybe you are doing some analysis, maybe you are not. But speaking from a privacy policy perspective, you can collect it for security purposes. That's fine. But let's say now you have employee well-being monitoring solution, and you want to use it as one of the perks or one of the cultural norms that you're offering within your buildings, within your business buildings. And for that, you need to measure, or you need to do some sort of video analytics, or build some sort of a video analytics solution. But again, back to privacy laws, you cannot use the CCTV footage or footage from any camera to repurpose it for video analytics. And if you want to do that, you have to ask consent. And secondly, if you do that, then it's just not scalable. Tomorrow, if you have another use case, same story. So in our case, what synthetic data can do is you can take all this video feed and transform it into artificial people. So it's CCTV camera, it sees me, but after transformation, it's not me, but someone who looks like me. And based on that, you can do your video analytics, that what I am doing, where I am going, and what are some of the aspects that need to be improved in the building to offer me a better environment.
Let's take a pause there. If I am now replacing Uzair with the avatar of Uzair, but the avatar is looking like Uzair, doing everything that Uzair does, talking like Uzair, moving like Uzair, then how is it different from Uzair?
So this goes back to the generation principle. Now, in this case, when we talk about facial data, one key area that regulations mandate that I have to protect is all information that can identify it's me. So one aspect is face. So let's say we take care of that. But second aspect is maybe my behavior is so predictable that if someone is in this room 3 p.m. eating something, this is Uzair. Then it becomes an identifier. And again, when we talk about creating synthetic data, we have to address it in a way that it changes the behavior by a bit, or in other words, it places another person or another or a few other people in the same room. So depending on what the use case is, there are different factors that we have to take into account for protecting privacy. Regulations tell us explicitly what we need to care for, but the behavior of someone is so unique. If my behavior today is not privacy invasive, it may be tomorrow if someone is like acutely observing me. And if that goes on a larger scale, then businesses have to take that into account as well. So all that kind of goes into the privacy preserving fundamentals or privacy by design. And over time, it's not a static exercise. It's a dynamic one as well. You do this today, it works, but may not work tomorrow. So you have to keep updating as you go.
Very interesting. I think this could be useful if in a building I'm trying to study footfall, traffic, how people are moving, and I have actual video footage. I can take that, convert that into synthetic data, and pass it on to a company that is trying to design for a better space within a building or a new building itself altogether, studying behavior from existing buildings.
Precisely.
So there's a real estate use case, right? Very interesting. Is this already being done, Uzair, or it's not? It's not yet?
Yes, so this is something that we are currently working on with a Japanese company. I cannot disclose their name, but the use case is within this scope.
Very interesting. Okay, you are pioneering this area. Now let's talk about security considerations and challenges that companies should be aware of when implementing such edge computing solutions. I think you spoke about it a little bit in terms of the identifiers. Is there anything else to keep in mind?
I think just to take a step back, if we assume there are no regulations in place, which was the case before 2018, like you had Facebook, you had Microsoft, you had so many companies which were mass collecting data. So just to take a step back, I strongly believe if we take data protection regulations out of the place, no one would really consider security and privacy that much. Again, I mean, as a market signal, if you look at 2018 and before, we have Facebook, we have Microsoft, we have a lot of tech companies which have been collecting a lot of data. There was no concept of user consent. There was no concept of opt-in, opt-out. There was no concept of how companies are using my data. Or even if they had some policies, they were well protected behind legalese language. So it's legal language that I don't understand, even if I try to study. So fast forward to today, privacy laws have changed all that. Privacy policies have to be user-friendly in English. User consent is required. Companies have to be held accountable for their practices. So when we talk about standard practices right now, whatever you do, I think you have to notify your users of that. That's one, mainly for compliance. Let's say, again, back to the CCTV example, you could just put up a notice, you are being monitored, and that's good enough for the use cases for security purposes. But if you're using this data for another use case, then you need to ask for explicit consent. It's something similar. You may have received emails where companies say we have updated our terms and conditions. You can review and just agree. And I mean, I'm guilty here as well. Without reading anything at all, we just click agree and go on. So it's just to notify all customers of all the changes, what's happening in terms of their data, and whether we need their consent or not. And it has to kind of go again hand in hand. And I would say users or customers have the last say, complemented by regulations.
Sarah, thank you very much. This has been educational. Thanks for sharing with us about your journey, about synthetic data as a topic, and how it's actually starting to come into almost every area of digital life. Almost.
Yeah.
It feels like that, right? Final question for you. What
Mhm.
advice would you give to researchers and entrepreneurs who are interested in this space, which is the intersection of AI, privacy, and data?
So my advice would be, again, this is a very, very dynamic space. You have legal people coming in, you have data scientists, data science people, AI people coming in, you have engineering as well as security personnel coming in. So from a domain perspective, I think it's as dynamic as it can get, which is exciting because you get a lot to learn, but it is also overwhelming because you have a lot to figure out. So I think for anyone who is interested to pursue this domain, there are many growth opportunities for the next 5 to 10 years, if I have to put a timeline to it. And secondly, I would say don't just go in it because it's in scope or if it's trending, but go in if you have a genuine interest, and only then you can capitalize on the growth opportunities, rather than going in for the trend and then overwhelming yourself, and then you fall into this rabbit hole where you can't figure things out, and when you lose your footing.
Thank you so much for sharing, Uzair. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. We hope to have you back for a second session, deeper dive into synthetic data, privacy, and AI. But for now, we'll take a pause. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Pramodh. Looking forward to it.